listener production. Hi, welcome to this episode of The Briefing. I'm Sasha Barbagat. All this week, we've been bringing you one-on-one interviews with the three major parties about their plans to fix Australia's housing crisis. Labor, the Liberals and the Greens had the opportunity to pitch directly to you. We asked them to avoid talking about their opponents' plans and drop the political spin and point scoring. And now that we've heard their pitches, it's time to get some analysis from an expert. Joining me now to break down everything we heard from Labor, the Coalition and the Greens is the Motley Fool's Chief Investment Officer, Scott Phillips. Scott, welcome back to The Briefing. Look, before we get to the policies, from your viewpoint, is it fair to describe the state of housing in Australia as in crisis, or are we maybe being a little bit too dramatic?
Oh, gee, that's a great question, Sasha, and thanks for having me. I think we're pretty close to that, mate. I think crisis is a nice grab, right? What we can say, I think, is housing has almost certainly never been less affordable. And if it has, only by a little bit, not for very long, right? So we have really, really unaffordable housing. We also have challenges for availability of housing. The rental vacancy rates are really, really low. People are sleeping in tents and cars. We probably can, frankly, call that combination a crisis. But if the term is too triggering for some people, just we have massive, massive housing problems that we really should fix quickly, we'll do the job.
Well, let's talk about fixing it. Now, this week we've had each of the major parties on the podcast to give their direct pitch to our listeners. So what we've got you on to do today is to give us a little bit of in-depth analysis on what their plan is. Let's start with Labor's plan. We've got a little bit of the interview with Claire O'Neill here.
Why is this all happening? When it comes back to it, it's actually something quite simple, and that is for all that 30-year period, we have not been building enough homes in our country.
That was Claire O'Neill. She's the housing minister, and she says the government's focus will be on supply. She also wants to focus on expanding assistance for first home buyers, working with the states on planning hold-ups, introducing a shared equity scheme as well. Through this, they argue rental prices will also be driven down and vacancy rates will go up. Give us your assessment, Scott.
Partly. What do we give that? 4 out of 10. So look, let's start with supply. The supply-demand thing is a real issue. We talked about rental vacancies. We talked about people in cars and houses. There aren't enough homes for the number of people, the number of households, families or just general households who want those houses. So you have to deal with supply and or demand. It's just basic economics 101, right? So that's important. And any strides towards it are important. The housing target they've got is almost certainly unattainable, short of some sort of massive change. So it's aspirational. They've called it that already to try and avoid the political heat, but they need more supply. Shared equity is a cop-out. Shared equity says housing is never going to be affordable enough, so the government's going to have to buy half of it with you. Now, that, as I said, is giving up on the real fundamental problem. This is the proverbial Band-Aid rather than dealing with the symptoms. In terms of, I guess, public housing, really, really important. So we should see more of that to the extent they're prepared to actually provide for it. They're addressing the things that are politically easy and economically easy without really getting to the nub of some of the real causes of our housing affordability problems.
Okay. Next up, let's have a look at the Coalition.
Utilising your savings within super, in a sense, borrowing from your super for the period of time that you need it and then putting it back in, we think is a really important policy, and it tips the scales in favour of first home buyers because investors can't tap into super, second and third home buyers can't tap into super. It's only first home buyers who will be able to tap into their own super to do this.
Okay, so that was Michael Sukkar, the Shadow Minister for Housing. So we heard there he wants first home buyers to be able to access their super. Another big focus for the Liberals will be significant cuts to migration. And those two policy points they're saying will also once again have an effect on rentals, making it cheaper and also allowing renters to step up and get into home ownership. What's your assessment? I liked your score out of 10 for Labor. So what do you give the Libs?
Oh, dear, oh, dear. I'm going to make it 4.5, mate. And I realised once I started giving a score that it's going to then sound political when I give other scores. So I've dug myself a hole, but I'll keep going. So super housing is the second worst idea in the housing debate right now. We're going to get to the Greens one in a minute. The reality is all of these solutions, any version of a first home buyer's grant, super for housing, first home buyer help, adds to demand, pushing prices up. We're not dealing with supply here. We're not dealing with the fundamentals of the demand, right? So what happens if you give someone 20, 30, 40 grand out of their super, that means they can bid more at auction. adds more to the demand side. It makes housing less affordable, not more. It does give super or first home buyers a little bit of an improved leg up to compared to now. I can't get it out of my super, but they can. So maybe they're a better chance of outbidding me at auction. But the reality is all it does is pushes prices further up. Some might say potentially that's exactly what the polies want. They want to hopefully solve, in air quotes, the problem without actually addressing the price of housing itself. So that's a really, really bad idea. The demand one is a good idea, but we've got to be really, really careful here, mate. We've had household formation exceeding dwelling growth. Now, that sounds like a word salad. Household formation is not population, right? Because if you come from overseas as a single or as a family of 6, you still need one home to live in. So it's not the population numbers, but it is household formation. The growth in that's exceeded dwelling growth. That's why we've got vacancies at less than 1%, much less than 1% around much of the country. So I do think we need to look at the growth in population as a function of available housing. It is just maths again. Now, that's not an excuse for racism or xenophobia. It's not an excuse for foreigners are bad. It's not an excuse for any of that stuff at all. We shouldn't care colour, creed, religion, race, anything else, gender, pick your group. The number of people that come to Australia and then need housing simply should be a function of the available housing itself. It makes no sense to do it otherwise, right? Bringing people here who then can't get a house or bringing people here who'll push an Australian out of a house, neither of those is a good solution. So they're right about limiting demand growth, largely through population growth or more importantly, household formation, at least until we get the supply solution fixed. Then we can look at what the right number of immigrants is. But for now, it's a probably pretty good and pretty important one as long as we stay out of the gutter of racism and xenophobia.
Yep. Okay. Couldn't agree more. Look, lastly, we have the Greens on, and they had a 3-pronged approach.
Our basic policy is the government would establish a publicly owned developer. Over the first 10 years, it would build 610,000 good quality homes. For renting, the rent would be no more than 25% of your income or 70% of market rent, whichever is cheaper.
So that was Max Chandler-Mather from the Greens. Now, he was speaking there about the government-owned developer, but also part of their plan is to freeze rents and also wind back negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions. Do you think this is a good plan?
Oh, this one's hard to score, mate, because I want to give 0 for some and 9 for others. And so it's a really, really difficult one to give a clear score to. As a group, it's let down by the bad stuff. Give it a 4. Capping rents is crazy. When you cap prices, you create distortions in markets. That leads to shortages. We know that. We've been through communist Russia. The Greens have fallen for good ideology, nice in theory. And frankly, if you don't have to implement it because you're not going to be in government, it's nice to be able to say, I'm going to fix all your problems with a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Rent freezes are a terrible idea. We know they don't work. More public housing, really, really important. That's a great move. And we should have much more public housing, much more affordable housing. It's part of what we need to do to house people who aren't on particularly high income. So that's really important. And I actually quite like their idea, at least conceptually, on negative gearing and capital gains tax. The capital gains tax discount of 50% has no basis in policy at all. There was no economic need for it. It was a vote buyer in 1999. It remains that way. People don't want it taken away, of course, because no one wants to lose money, but there is no need for it, and it does make housing more affordable. Similarly, negative gearing does make housing more expensive. It simply is going to push up prices. Why? Because if you're a potential landlord, you take the rental return, you take the tax benefit, and then you take whatever money you've got to add to the pot to pay the mortgage. Those three together tell you how much you can afford to pay at auction or at sale. If you take out the tax advantage, then guess what? You're not going to be able to pay the same price because rent and your own money is not going to cover the same repayments as it would if you include that tax benefit. So reviewing negative gearing is really, really important. It is going to put some noses out of joint. That's just kind of life. So again, some really, really important parts of that policy, some really positive ones. Some of it, though, unfortunately, sounds good, works badly in practice. That's what brings the score down for me.
Okay, so they're all pretty even, the Libs with just a tiny nose out in front of the other two.
Yeah.
What do you think is missing from what all of the majors have put forward as plans? What do you think could actually address the crisis?
Oh, wow, that's great. So let's start with negative gearing and capital gains tax. I would remove negative gearing for all residential property, but I would grandfather it for those who are already using it. Why? Because pulling the rug out from them is probably not fair or reasonable. It's also not particularly politically palatable, right? So getting this one through, you simply say to new purchasers, sorry, you can't have negative gearing on residential property. Why? Because it's shelter first and a financial asset second and probably a distant second. So we've got to keep affordability front and centre. Capital gains tax I've already talked about. It's simply not necessary. We used to use a process called indexation. I won't go into it now, but effectively it means you're not taxed on inflation, but you don't get an arbitrary discount just because someone thinks it sounds good. APRA, the banking regulator, should use the lending buffer, the amount they add to bank interest rates to assess a mortgage, counter-cyclically. They should increase it when rates fall. What that would have done, by the way, over the last few years is stop people taking out super big mortgages in 2020 and 2021 when rates were 2% and then finding themselves in struggle street now at 6.5% you're paying back on your mortgage. That would allow the RBA to change economic stimulus without impacting house prices. That's really important. The demand side we've talked about. I do think we need to make sure that the demand growth, the household formation, is a function of available property. So we don't bring people in who simply can't find a house or who put extra pressure on people already here. Again, natural born or immigrants, I don't care, to be pushed out of housing or make housing stress an issue for them. And then public housing. We need to invest meaningfully in more public housing to make sure there is enough total supply and affordable supply for those people who need it. If you do those things, I think you're in a much, much, much better position. You return housing to what it should be, which is shelter first and financial instruments second. I'm an investor, right? It's what I do for a quid. But the economy should serve society, not the other way around.
Maybe you should be a politician.
Don't wish that on me.
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't dare.
Thank you.
But speaking of politics, you know, at the end of the day, we see it get in the way of so many great policy ideas or ones that are going to benefit people or make a difference. Do you think this is the case with housing as well, that politics is just getting in the way of positive policies making it through?
Yes, entirely, mate, because in our current political climate, whenever you see a chink in someone's armour, whenever you can create some fear, uncertainty, some doubt, some risk of loss, you can make hay with that sort of policy, right? And so, unfortunately, our politics in the last decade or two, we know international examples of populism have reared their ugly heads. The same is happening here at home. And it just simply makes it harder for a politician to do the right thing. That being said, they don't get a free pass. If you're in government, whichever party happens to be in government at whatever point in time, your job is to lead the country, do the best thing for the country. You don't get to say, oh, if I do the right things, then someone else might be mean to me. That's playground stuff. That is not politics. If you're not there to make a positive difference, get out. Let someone else have a go. So is it making it hard? Absolutely. Focus groups and the usual political polling make them too scared and too timid to do anything at all. So there are some real issues with the way our politics is run. And yes, it's getting in the way of much better policy, but that's partly some opportunism from oppositions, plural. It's also, frankly, some cowardice from governments, plural, when it comes to doing what's right rather than simply what they can get away with or what's going to earn them some short-term bounces in the polls.
Before we let you go, Scott, I did ask all three representatives what their verdict was on the state of the future of housing in this country, and I'd love to hear the same from you. So in your opinion, can Australia's housing mess or crisis or problem be fixed, or should we just adjust to this new normal? Is this what it's going to be for forevermore?
I am anything other than a fatalist, mate. I'm a born optimist to bordering on Pollyanna, despite my concerns about the way the state of our politics at the moment. If we give up on trying to make things better, then we might as well give up on representative democracy, right? We're there to improve things. We all want to leave the country better for our kids and their kids than the country we inherited from our parents. We've got to hold to that, right? We've got to demand better from ourselves, from our electorate, frankly, each other, and from our politicians. Can it be fixed? Absolutely. I've just given you a list of things I would do. They're not necessarily perfect. Others have other and maybe even better ideas. But no, we absolutely should not give up. And that's why I'm concerned about the Help to Buy stuff is kind of saying, well, I can't fix the price, but I can give you some money. We need to go back and say, you know what, this needs to serve, economic policy needs to serve our society. Housing policy needs to serve society. All it requires is a bit of gumption, a bit of, frankly, guts and vision from politicians. And while that might seem an unusual and unlikely outcome, I'm not giving up. I'm going to stay optimistic because I reckon if we push them hard enough, we can get some positive change.
Yeah, well, it's not too long till the election. Scott Phillips from The Motley Fool, thank you so much for joining us and for giving us your analysis today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The Motley Fool's Chief Investment Officer, Scott Phillips, speaking with me there. And that is all for this episode of The Briefing. If you got something out of this episode or particularly enjoyed it, it'd be so great if you could share it with someone you think might enjoy it as well. And if you want to keep up with our other content, don't forget we put up full episodes of our weekend briefing chats on YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. We're also on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. Search us up on TikTok at Listener Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feed tomorrow at 6 a.m. I'm Sasha Barbagat. I'll see you then.